Hello and welcome back to the Blc Box. My name is Rory O'Neill. I'm joined in the box by Master Alistair Hodge. Alistair is barrister at 5 Essex Courts Chambers in London. He specialises in employment law and education law matters. He's also a Master of the Bench and a senior advocacy trainer at the Honourable Society of the Inner Temple. He's a professor of advocacy at Nottingham University, and he regularly teaches the art of advocacy all over the world. And we're talking places from Warsaw to the Cayman Islands, from Poznan to Singapore, from Jersey to Gdańsk. He also just so happens to be the greatest pub quiz quizmaster on the British Isles. Alistair, welcome to the BLC podcast today.
It's an absolute pleasure to be here. I heard you mentioning Poznan there, which was, of course, where you and I first met.
Many moons ago.
Many moons ago.
Yeah, indeed. So I've known Alistair for quite a few years now. I've had him get involved in various initiatives in Central Europe to do some advocacy training to improve the situation of advocacy training among lawyers and law students in the Central and Eastern European region. And everybody who has ever had Alistair as an advocacy trainer has said that he is a superstar, legend. Lots of other big words have been used to describe the type of trainer that Alistair is. So it's really, I'm very happy that you are the one who is joining us today for our first podcast after the summer holidays have ended and the new academic year has begun. We're going to be talking about you. We're going to be talking about what you think are good qualities that a law student should expect to have to become a good advocate, barrister, and then we're going to look at we're going to talk about how you became a barrister. So what attracted you to become a barrister, Alistair?
I think it's not an easy question to answer. I think the first seeds of it were sown many years ago when I was a child, and on the television one evening came the late great Leo McKern, the actor portraying Rumpole of the Bailey, who was, and the character Rumpole was a barrister who had been created by a real barrister called Johnny Mortimer. And Johnny Mortimer wrote a series of books all about Rumpole's, this fictitious barrister's cases, and they were eventually televised by ITV in the 1970s and early 1980s. And I remember watching that and thinking, yeah, that's something that I might like to do, but I guess you then forget about it until you're at secondary school and you're thinking about what you're going to do by way of a degree. Everything comes rolling back in. All the careers advice says, you know, you should read law because you're windswept, you're interesting, you're exotic, you're a performer. You know, the bar is a career worth considering. And then obviously did a law degree, did what was then known as the BVC, the Bar Vocational Course, which is after your your law training, you learn the basic skills of being a barrister, then undertake pupillage, and then start in practice. So I guess the seeds were sown at a very, very early age.
Okay. So what qualities then do you think a law student should have for them to consider if they would become a good barrister in the future?
I think because the way that the profession now works and because there is so much competition, I think at law student level, it's very important now to be able to stand yourself out from every other candidate to have some unique quality that, whether on an application form or when members of a set of chambers meet you at interview, is going to leap out and make you stand out. Because everybody now, although I haven't been involved in the applications system in my own chambers for a few years, all the candidates now have very good law degrees or very good law conversion courses. They've got good school examinations. Everybody's got the same academic qualifications and everyone is very good. So you have to look to the other skills that are required of a barrister to actually differentiate between candidates. The ability to public speak, of course, is number one. If you're going to do any form of advocacy, you've got to be able to stand up, to perform in representing clients in court. I think the other skill that you can acquire through experience is obviously attention to detail, but at the same time, the ability to read a large amount of documentation, but assimilate that information very, very quickly without missing out key things. I mean, I remember a case I did many years ago, and I put my hands up to this. I hope my client from then isn't watching. But I think the judge raised with me a particular point and said, well, Mr. Hodge, what about page 57? And I think my reaction was, well, I haven't read page 57. I don't know what page 57 says. But it's that attention to detail. It's that ability to hold large amounts of information. And I think, like many professions, the third thing I would throw in is the ability to work under pressure. It can be a stressful job. It comes with lots of perks. It comes with lots of good times, but you still, in certain cases, the stressful times.
Okay, so I have a follow-on question from a couple of things. I have two follow-on questions from what you've just said. So in a couple of weeks, the topic of the podcast will be about the process for Central and Eastern European law students to qualify in the UK as barristers. Now, you said, one of the things you said was that it's a very competitive profession to get into. So one question I would like to ask you is, do you think that is would you recommend that law students from Central and Eastern Europe should try or aspire to qualify either as their first profession or dual qualify in England and Wales as advocates?
The profession itself has changed tremendously in the last 22 years or so since I started at the bar, and even then there was a process of change. If you went back to the late 90s, it would be exceedingly rare to have anyone pursuing a career at the bar who had not lived the majority of their life in England and Wales, because that's the home jurisdiction. But things are very different now. You know, thinking has moved on. And I can think of one member of my own chambers. I mean, I won't name him for obvious reasons, but he's originally from Ukraine, and he sort of came here some years ago to study English law. Obviously graduated, I think, with a first-class degree in law. His command of the English language is obviously impeccable. He then did the bar professional training course. He secured pupillage with my chambers, and he's been a tenant in chambers ever since. So there is no, if you like, jurisdictional bar to people from Eastern European countries coming to study over here. I don't think the position post-Brexit is going to change real way. What I would say, of course, is you'll be learning English law. You will need that command of English as your second language. I mean, that must be right. And then, of course, entering, if you're going to be an advocate in this country, if you're going to be doing oral advocacy, the judge has to understand the English that you are using in court. But there is certainly no bar whatsoever for people to attempt to practice over here. I think just as a final point, you mentioned in the question the concept of dual qualification. And I think this is just my gut sort of speaking, my sort of gut feeling is, sort yourself out, whether in Poland or otherwise, and get qualified there before investigating, the potential to come over here, rather than putting all your eggs in one basket.
Okay, that's good. That's what I would recommend to my students if they asked me that question as well. So I'm glad that you said that. So then actually another follow-on question from that. So you have lots of experience teaching advocacy in short courses to law students at our universities, at Blc universities, and also other places in the region. Do you see any big differences in the skill set or the level of skills of law students at the stage of while they're still at university from UK students?
That's actually because I've taught so many people, it's very difficult to sort of answer that, because no matter what jurisdiction or where I teach, I think if we look firstly at university level, there are always going to be some absolute stars. I remember if we go back to, you'll remember, if we go back to 2015, December, when we were doing that course in Poznan, at the university level, there were those who were as quiet as mice and just sort of sat there and were happy to watch and enjoy the show. But then there were the other more confident individuals at university level who were prepared to have a go at some of the exercises, to put their own personalities on the line for doing a little bit of the advocacy. So you're always going to get those who are sort of there thinking, yes, this is what I want to do, this is where my life is going, to those who are slightly more reserved, slightly more timid. And I have to say that that's the same no matter what, no matter where the university is. It's the same as universities in England and Wales. You go along to do a promotional event for the English bar, and there will be those who instantly are natural performers. They're going to be the ones that are quite loud, that are quite boisterous, that are definitely wanting to go into the profession. Whereas there'll be other students who are quite reserved, quite timid. And so I don't think you can say there's a geographical variation. I just think within every institution, there are some that instantly say, wow, here I am, take me, I'm yours. And there are others who are slightly quieter.
So how important do you rate that characteristic of personality?
Well, I think it's important to note that not every advocate, not every barrister needs to have that sort of overt side. I mean, that's part of me, that's just how I do it. But I know several barristers who are very quiet in the way that they deliver their advocacy. And that, in some cases, is equally effective.
Okay. So one of the requirements of qualifying as a barrister is that you need to be a member of one of the 4 Inns of Court in England and Wales. And you are a Master of the Bench of Inner Temple. Can I ask, like back in the day, do you remember why did you choose Inner Temple?
Yeah, that's a very good question. Before I answer it, maybe for the benefit of some of the viewers who may not know about the Inns of Court, if you are going to practice as a barrister in England and Wales, you have to be a member of one of the 4 Inns of Court. And you have Inner Temple, Middle Temple, Gray's Inn, and Lincoln's Inn. And a lot of the university events that I go to, or indeed the student events that we run within my inn, Inner Temple, one of the most popular questions that I get asked is, well, which Inn of Court should I join? And the answer, the proper answer to the question is, visit all 4 inns. If lunch is available at them, take a meal, sample the food, and just get a flavour for the grounds and the surroundings, and join whichever one you like. There's no difference. There's no difference between the 4 inns. They all serve the same function. But at student events, I like to make things a little bit different. And I have a stock answer that I use. And for those of you, for the people watching this at home, or at their offices, they'll know that there is a Star Wars reference coming here. But they sort of come up to me and they'll say, well, Master Hodge, which inn of court should I join? And usually I sort of say to them, well, let's consider each of the 4 inns. Let's start with Gray's Inn. Well, not actually too sure where that is. And the reason I say that is because Gray's Inn is quite a long way away from the sort of main legal hub. So that's Gray's Inn out of the equation. And then I sort of say, well, if you want to do property work or tax work or chancery work, or indeed we have a lot of students from Malaysia, Lincoln's Inn is the inn for you, because Lincoln's Inn has amazing connections with both the judiciary and the lawyers in Kuala Lumpur and various other issues, other people in Malaysia. But of course, if it's someone who is non-Malaysian or who doesn't look as though they're going to be doing property work, what I will say is, well, that doesn't strike me that you're one of those candidates. And they'll sort of say, no, I'm not. So I then say, well, that just leaves Inner Temple and Middle Temple. And I then say this: unless you want to turn to the dark side of the Force and become a Sith Lord, then if you want to do that, then Middle Temple is the inn for you. If you want to go and learn the ways of Darth Sidious or Darth Vader or Count Dooku or whoever it was in Star Wars, then Middle Temple is the inn for you, which of course leaves Inner Temple, which is my inn. So that's the somewhat salesman-like pitch that I make to students in an effort to get them to join the Inner Temple. The reality is that you join whichever inn you like. Back to your actual original question, why did I join Inner Temple? Well, of course, remember that when I joined Inner Temple, it was in an era prior to email, prior to the internet, and anything like that. And to communicate with individuals, we had to do it by handwritten or typewriter. And my great passions in life, and it's probably one of the only sports I've ever been any good at, is golf. And I knew from what I had read that each Inn of Court had its own golfing society, all of which came together in a sort of overarching bar golfing society. And what I did before joining an inn is that I wrote handwritten letters, getting a hold of their chambers' addresses and their names. I wrote handwritten letters to the secretaries of each of the 4 inns' golfing societies. And I received no reply from Middle Temple, Gray's Inn, or Lincoln's Inn. And in fact, he and I are still good friends. The then secretary of the Inner Temple Golfing Society was a man called Mark Shaw, who is now Mark Shaw Queen's Counsel. And as I say, Mark and I have played golf together for years, and we remain very good friends. And Mark was the only secretary that wrote back and sort of said, well, you'll obviously need to join an inn, and if you join Inner Temple, we'd love to have you in the golfing society. And that, in a nutshell, was my reason for joining Inner Temple. It was the only golfing secretary who wrote back to me when I first inquired about golf. And everyone will have their own reason.
It is a fantastic, atypical response to my answer to my question. Okay. So among other things, among other titles that you have at the Inner Temple, you are a master of Inner Temple, a master of the bench. So that sounds high and medieval. Can you explain to us what is that, and how would one acquire such a title?
Of course. Little slip from your question. You sort of said that I was the master of the temple. Well, I am not. As you rightly say, I am a master of the bench. The master of the temple is Robin Griffith Jones, who is, of course, the vicar or priest who is in charge of the wonderful temple church that we have on the Inner Temple and Middle Temple land. But benchers, a master of the bench, they've been around for many, many years. And in very simple terms, it denotes a senior member of the inn. And when you get to sufficient seniority, the criteria for becoming a bencher, firstly, that you've got a good career path going at the bar. But secondly, and perhaps more importantly, that you have contributed to the life and whether it be social or education and training of your in court. Obviously, in my case, it would be in a temple. And historically, it was obviously, as many things were at the bar, it was you waited for the tap on the shoulder. Young man, you become a bencher, very important, thing like that. Whereas now it's far more transparent, and anybody can apply to be a bencher if they think they meet the criteria. And we have an open application system every May, and people obviously need to be proposed and seconded by existing benchers, certified of landing and do things for they have done things for the inn. And those applications are all put together and they come to, I'm actually on the committee at the moment that selects the new benchers. And we have a meeting, and from all the applications, we select them. What does it actually mean in practice? Well, very little. It doesn't affect your practice as a barrister in any shape or form, but it does affect your relationship with your Inn of Court, because it's the bencher, it's a master of the bench that a student would require in order to be called to the bar. Now, we haven't touched on the ceremony of being called to the bar, but effectively, once you've completed your bar course training, the sort of ceremony at the end is what we call call to the bar. And again, this is all largely historic. What you need is a master of the bench to actually move your call to the bar. And what it involves me doing in the temple church is if, for example, that there were a student and I was calling them to the bar, as part of the ceremony, I have to stand up and look at the senior members of the inn, or the senior member of the inn, who's known as the treasurer, and say, Master Treasurer, I move his or her call. And so the function of the bencher is to bring new people into the profession at that ceremony. We're also encouraged, to attend the student educational events, because it's nice for the students to see senior members of the inn there, so that we can pass on our wisdom to the next generation of students, as it were. The only downside of actually becoming a bencher, I mean, it's a great privilege. I remember the day that, or the year I became a bencher in 2014, and the day that the benchers had their meeting and the results were announced. I had actually done a case in Birmingham, and I was on my way to Reading, so I was staying overnight at the Holiday Inn just off the M40 at High Wycombe. And I got a text message from Master Ross, who had been my campaign manager, saying, congratulations, you've got it. And I was absolutely over the moon. It was one of the best things that happened to me. And so I went to my local Frankie and Benny's, and I had a starter of squid, followed by a cheeseburger, followed by some mint choc chip ice cream, all washed down with a bottle of Frascati Italian white wine. And that was my celebratory thing. But the point of the story is this: once you get back to normality, you then get a letter which sort of says, congratulations on your election as a bencher. Just to let you know that your election is subject to you paying the bencher joining fee, currently £1,480. So the inn will sting you for a sort of one-off payment. And of course, nobody tells you that you're going to have to pay this money. You just do. It's just tradition and convention. But once you manage to pick yourself up from the floor thinking, where the hell am I going to find 1,480 quid? You sort things out and everything's a-okay. But it's a great thing. It's a great position to be in. And I suppose we appoint between 15 and 20 new benchers each year.
Okay. The description of your celebratory meal is a fine example of the legendary attention to detail necessary for successful barristers who then become benchers. So I'm going to ask you a few questions now about advocacy skills themselves. So you teach advocacy all over the world. Why do you think it's important to learn advocacy skills as a lawyer? I'll use the general description. I won't just say barristers, lawyers generally.
Yeah. Again, I think that this is something that's changed over time, and I've obviously, as part of with my professor of advocacy hat on, I've researched this. If you go back to the middle of the 20th century, no matter what jurisdiction you were in, whether it be America, whether it be Australia, whether it be the UK, everybody took the view that advocacy as a skill could not be taught. You know, there was no way you could actually learn how to make a submission to a judge, or how to make a speech to a jury, or how to cross-examine a witness. You learnt it by experience. You appeared in the 1940s in front of such brutes as Mr. Justice Karminski, who would sever the advocate limb from limb, and blood would be spilled all over the walls. But the advocate would learn from the experience of being savaged by that judge. But then what you had historically is you had, certainly for our jurisdictions, I'll park America, but for our jurisdictions, you had a gentleman with whom I know you've had some dealings, and we talked together last year or the year before, is George Hampel. And the wonderful George Hampel in Australia first came to he developed his own way of teaching advocacy, which has become known as the Hampel Method. And it's been modified by him over the years. But George first came to London in the 80s or the early 90s, had a meeting with senior members from each of the four inns and said, look, you know, we've never done this before, but I think I've found a way that advocacy can be taught, that we can provide lawyers at an early stage of their careers with the foundations upon which the experience can then build their advocacy skills. And I totally agree, because as you mentioned earlier, I've had the privilege of teaching advocacy all around the world and seeing different jurisdictions, seeing different lawyers do it in different ways. But the fundamental skills of how to cross-examine, or the fundamental way you structure a speech to a jury, the way you structure a submission to a judge, no matter what the jurisdiction, no matter what the stylistic issues of the advocacy are, the principles are the same, the building blocks are the same. And if we, as advocacy trainers, can give advocates, barristers, lawyers, whatever you want to call them, at the early stages of their careers, if we can give them those skills right at the very start, then they're going to be ahead of the game when it comes to adding the experience. And that is one of the reasons why I think for lawyers that advocacy training is imperative. You don't want someone to go into court for their first appearance where they've never done it before. Because what we hope we can do as trainers is send them out into the big wide world so that the fear of the unknown, the making of the application for summary judgment that I've never done before, feels more familiar, because we've been taught the skills of how we make that application for summary judgment, how to structure it, how the judge will actually appreciate the nature of the application. And that is why I think advocacy training is of vital importance.
And do you think it's possible to identify specific skills that every trainee lawyer should learn at the early stages of their careers, irrespective of whether they're going to practice in a common law jurisdiction or a civil law jurisdiction?
I think that's the question. And in fact, I don't think it matters, regardless of jurisdiction, because this was actually identified by a body that sort of still exists, but no longer has any real significance, called COIC, C-O-I-C, the Committee of the Inns of Court. And if you go back to the late 90s, early noughties, those skills of which you speak became known as the Dutton Criteria. Now, let me explain what I mean by the Dutton Criteria. Timothy Dutton, Queen's Counsel, at the time was heavily involved in the sort of progression of advocacy training through the four inns. And when the concept of advocacy assessment was first mooted, and we, in fact, at Inner Temple did the trial run in 2009, but earlier than that, when they were putting together the assessment process, the question obviously arose, well, what are the fundamental skills that we should be teaching our advocates? And Tim Dutton came up, as I say, with these four criteria that have become known as the Dutton Criteria, and they are the four key skills that we would expect to teach any barrister or whatever stage in England or Wales. Firstly, the ability to make a closing speech stroke submission. So we would actually deal with it both in a civil case and a criminal case, but only one of the assessment criteria is the ability to make an oral argument, whether it be to a jury or whether it be to a judge. The second skill upon which we focus is that of examination in chief, the ability of the barrister to ask questions of their own witness to get their witness to tell the story of what happened in a particular case. Third skill, cross-examination, turning it on its head, the ability of the advocate to ask questions of a witness on the other side, to challenge their evidence, to test the credibility of that particular witness. And the fourth skill is actually a written one rather than an oral one, the ability to draft what we call in the UK skeleton arguments. And that is being able to set out in very brief terms in writing, whether it be for an application or a trial, what in essence you are going to say in your closing submission. So those are the four Dutton criteria, and if you like, they're the fundamentals that we will teach pupil barristers and as people as they go through their career. Those are the key skills upon which we focus. There are obviously other training courses we run. We have a specialist course dealing with the cross-examination of expert witnesses, where you've got an expert in a case who has a greater knowledge of a particular subject matter than you do as the lawyer. How do you cross-examine that individual? Another thing that's very big in the UK at the moment is how we deal with what we call vulnerable witnesses, people with mental health incapacities, minors, children, people like that. And we're now developing a way of cross-examining those individuals that would be very different to a traditional destructive cross-examination that we might do of a normal witness. It's a very different, touchy-feely, gentle approach to cross-examination when you're dealing with someone who's vulnerable. So within all the four skills, you're now getting subsets of skills that we as advocacy trainers are developing programs for each, if you like, stage of someone's career.
Okay. And what would you say as a response to a punchy trainee advocate in Warsaw or Prague who would tell you that cross-examination isn't possible in their courts, so this is not a useful skill for them to acquire? What would you say?
Well, we had this in Gdansk, and I can't remember his name, but I remember having such a lovely argument with one of the Gdansk judges, who said to me that he, in his court, he would permit in cross-examination the advocate to ask the question, "Is your name Alistair Hodge?" He would not permit me to say to a witness, "Your name is Alistair Hodge, isn't it?" And I was trying to explain to him that there is actually no difference between those two types of question. And we had a wonderful debate about it. The other members of the group, I think, switched off and went and had lunch. But he and I continued to debate this issue for some time. And I still don't understand where he was coming from. I can slightly. We keep in touch via email and we've corresponded about it. But the thing about the skills, for example, you raise of cross-examination, these skills or the principles of cross-examination aren't just relevant to cross-examination. No matter what field you end up in, if you're interviewing a witness as a police officer, if you're acting as a lawyer but not in court, any of the oral skills that we would teach in cross-examination are totally relevant to people's everyday lives. These aren't skills that are unique to cross-examination. It's just a wonderful way to ask questions.
Shall we call it transferable skills?
That's exactly what it is. It's a transferable skill. Let me give you an example. I remember teaching a lady on a course in Manchester in the UK, lovely lass, and she sat 4 years after the course, and she had never, ever cross-examined anyone after having done my course. You know, she said, I've never been to court, I've never used anything you taught me. But she did tell me that her private life had absolutely transformed because of my teaching of cross-examination. Because no longer at midnight, when her boyfriend came in from the pub after about 10 pints of lager, you know, she would ask him, she would examine him in chief of where have you been? What time do you call this? Who were you with? But of course, that gives him the opportunity to say whatever he wants. But she comes to my course on cross-examination and learns the power of how to ask the leading question in cross-examination. And so when he came in rolling drunk at midnight, the question was turned around. Not who were you with, but you've been with Natalie again, have you? You've been drinking lager, you've been here, you've been there. And that puts him on the spot. It makes him nervous. And that, I think, is a brilliant skill to go. And they were still together, but she had far more control over her boyfriend than she had before she came to one of my courses. And if I can preserve marital or boyfriend-girlfriend harmony in any relationship in the world, I've contributed something to the love that we should all feel for each other.
So from the side of the trainer, but also from the side of the participants, what do you think are the ingredients that make us successful, what you would describe as a successful advocacy training session?
Well, I think, firstly, the ability of the trainer, let's focus on the trainer first. The ability of the trainer to very, very quickly identify in the group of maybe 6 people we would work with in a group, to identify who are the strong advocates and who are perhaps the slightly weaker advocates. Because I would always vary my teaching style depending on how I instantly assessed the individual. If I think I've got somebody very strong and I'm playing the judge, I will give them a slightly harder time, you know, in picking them up on various things. But if I've got someone who maybe doesn't have the confidence, who maybe is a little bit shy, then I'll obviously approach both the playing of the judge and the teaching in a much gentler way. So from a trainer perspective, you know, you should always try and identify early on who the better candidate. I might well sort of say, well, Steve, where do you think that went wrong? You know, and actually get them to self-evaluate and work it out for themselves where something started to go wrong. But with someone who's weaker, I would probably do most of the teaching myself and sort of say, just take them back to my note and say, well, you asked this question, and then look what the witness said. Now, the problem, and actually feed the individual much more. As a participant on a course, I think one of the things that I see on a lot of courses is that people turn up feeling incredibly nervous, that they're not going to be able to do it, that they're out of their depth. That in fact, I mean, I remember when I went on a course 22 years ago, there is a mentality that everybody else in the group is going to be 10 times better than you are. And that, in most cases, for the people watching, if you go to an advocacy course, if you're feeling that, don't worry about it at all, because one, it's totally natural. And secondly, when you actually get into the training session, you will find that not everybody else is 10 times better than you, and that everybody is probably on a par in terms of. I'm not trying to sort of embarrass people or to ridicule them by making them do advocacy exercises. My role is to make them better and to ensure that it's a session that they enjoy.
So then, obviously, because advocacy teaching involves what some people might describe as criticism, feedback, constructive feedback, but there will always be somebody in the group who will take that badly, either because they're nervous or they're very insecure. Like, how would you deal with the pushback that you would sometimes get?
The Hampel Method of advocacy training, devised by George, that we spoke about earlier, is a critical teaching method. There isn't the opportunity within the Hampel method for praise, to actually say to someone, you are very good. What you did there was fantastic. It doesn't allow for that. And your point is well made. There are a lot of people I teach who see it totally as a negative. And I think the way around it is really threefold. Firstly, what I would always do with a group of 6 people, if I were teaching them, let's say, for multiple sessions, is I would remind them at the start of the day that we will be using the Hampel method. And they all know what the method is, and they all know that it is critical in nature. It's not that they aren't going to have praise put upon them in any of the training sessions. What I like to do as a trainer to soften that, and I think it's a key element of the day, are the various breaks, whether it be for morning coffee or at lunch or at tea in the afternoon if we're doing a full day. And what I like to do is just actually have, even if it's just a minute or 30 seconds, one-to-one at the tea break station, the coffee station, whatever it is, with each member of my group, and just sort of say, everything okay, you're having a good day. And while I take my coffee, as I walk away, I'll say, you nailed that cross-examination earlier. And that's just the little bit of positivity. We don't do it in the formal sessions, but it's just that little boost at coffee or at lunch that makes them think, yeah, I'm getting this. So whilst Alistair is picking up things for the purposes of the advocacy review, everything else that I'm doing is actually good. So that's really how I would deal with that. The third aspect, because I mentioned obviously, make it clear to them the Hampel method would be used, bits of praise in the breakout sessions when there are breaks. And I think that the third issue is this. Again, it goes back to the answer to a previous question. You work out very, very quickly if you have slightly weaker candidates in the group. And I will do, throughout the day, I will spend a little bit more time with them. So whilst I might do a Hampel review for a very fine advocate, take Dr. Tourette by way of example. We know he is a fine advocate, and we know that he likes to change gear manually on his car using his little paddle, because apparently it saves fuel consumption. I've never worked that out myself. But let's take Steve, who's a great advocate. He does a performance, and I might use a review that lasts 2.5, 3 minutes. But if I've got a candidate who needs a little bit more work, my review with them might last 5 or 6 minutes. But I'll always keep my eye on the time to make sure that the session doesn't overrun. So those are the 3 things that I would deploy.
As a follow-on question, is there what's the logic behind the absence of praise in the Hampel method?
He will give you what I consider, I hope he's not watching this, but George will probably give you an unsatisfactory answer in that it's just that, because George viewed the Hampel method originally as if you were going to your doctor, okay? So if you imagine that you're not feeling well and you go to your doctor, what's the first thing you want the doctor to do? Give you a headline. In other words, tell you something that is wrong, because that's what doctor isn't going to tell you. Oh, Alistair, you're looking great. You've got rid of your acne or whatever it may be. The doctor will tell you what is wrong with you. And then, of course, the playback element of the advocacy review, the doctor will tell you, what the symptoms are and what has led you to this. Then the rationale, why am I feeling this way? Why is there something wrong with me? Because you're not getting enough vitamin D in your diet, or you're not getting enough fiber, or whatever it may be. And then, how do I put it right? The remedy, the doctor gives you pills, or the doctor gives you an injection, or whatever it is. So that was George's original basis for the advocacy review, as if you were going to a doctor's surgery. And I think based on that is why there is no praise. Because a doctor, if you've got an illness, doesn't tell you how wonderful you are. They sort out what is wrong with you. How do we bring in the sort of praise element? Well, the Hampel review always, as I said, begins with that headline topic. No leading questions, whatever the headline may be. One of the things that I like to do, which whilst we're told as trainers, you never start reviewing advocacy by saying, that was very good, but. I mean, that's the wrong way of doing it. You pick up on the critical aspect, but what we are allowed to do is a slightly softer intro, that as we walk over to teach the pupil, to sit with the pupil to do the review, that you refer to what you're about to do as simply applying a little bit of polish. You know, it's the cherry on top of the cake, or however you want to phrase it, because that sends the message to the pupil barrister that in fact everything else they have done is great stuff, and all that I am doing as the trainer is applying that tiny little bit of polish, or that little cherry, to take it from what is a good performance to an excellent performance.
Okay. So I'm going to ask one final question, and then we'll wrap up this podcast. And it's about teaching practical legal skills online. So quite possibly what COVID has done, even if the disease itself or the virus goes or disappears from society, something has started to move, and it's inevitable that it's going to continue, that we're going to be doing more teaching online, and that includes legal skills. Do you think it's possible to teach practical skills online? And if you do, what kind of tips could you give a trainer for doing it?
Okay, point number one, the thing to do is to ask me this question again at the end of September, by which time I will have actually run three-day online courses myself. So I'll be able to tell you whether it works or not. What I can say is that obviously lecture presentations, where you have a number of people on Zoom just watching you present, that's absolutely fine. You can do that. Can we teach advocacy online? Well, the answer I think is yes. And certainly at the Inner Temple, we've been working with University College London to develop a teaching platform. Now, I believe platform is the word that is used for things like Zoom or Starleaf or whatever it may be. And we ran a pilot with 6 new practitioners, so barristers in their first 3 years of practice. And we ran a pilot a couple of months ago, and I was obviously teaching on the pilot scheme. And I had my reservations about it. I thought this isn't going to work. This is not going to give the barrister the training that they need. All I can say is that pilot scheme proved me wrong, and proved me wrong big time, because the way it has been designed, the software and the development of the technology, I mean, it's a simple platform with cameras, but the beauty is, just like if we were, let's say, at one of our teaching venues, Watton House, where a pupil barrister would do a performance, they would get a review, and then they would maybe go next door to look at the video recording, what we call video review. On this platform, I would have, as I have you on my screen here on gallery view, you would do the performance, I would give you a review, and then our technical people behind the scenes simply press a button at their end, and the pupil barrister is transported to a different online room where there is a different trainer waiting to do the video review. So whilst I don't think there will ever be any substitute for face-to-face advocacy training, certainly what Inner Temple and what University College London has developed over the last few months is an amazing starting point in terms of the technology for being able to continue advocacy teaching during this COVID period and potentially beyond. Because one of the things that we're introducing into the pupil course for the Inner Temple, which again I've had to redesign because of COVID, and we've got it coming up in November. But one of the things we're introducing is actually a session on advocacy via Zoom. How do we as advocates change our style when all we're doing is looking at a camera than if we're actually in a courtroom with a jury and people there? And of course, the key tip that I've been giving out so far is when you're making a submission and you're just simply looking at a camera, you've got to slow down your pace of delivery. And that is probably the key fundamental for online advocacy, is you make it much slower than it would be were you looking at a judge or a jury in person. But it is possible, and the technology will continue to develop. But as I say, I don't personally yet think it's any substitute for what I would call face-to-face training, which I hope will return.
Okay, so I know I said that was my last question, but because of what you just said, I have two follow-on questions. Well, one follow-on question and one not exactly follow-on question. If you have 5 to 7 more minutes, can I ask you a couple more questions?
Yes, I do. I don't have. Yes, I don't have to speak to anyone until 11:30 a.m. my time. So ask away. I'm all yours.
Okay. Follow-on question. So you are doing an online advocacy review, and the pupil is quite possibly sitting in their bedroom. Would you still advise them to be suited and booted, ready to perform? How would you make them feel comfortable? Like, what would that look like?
Well, the first thing is obviously what we don't want are people coming on to advocacy courses and cross-examining people lying flat on their backs in bed, because that's not how you would do it in practice. So what we, going back to the pilots, sent out to the 6 advocates saying, please ensure that you are in a quiet place, that the decor behind is relative. I mean, I'm actually broadcasting from Scotland. This is my father's study up in Scotland, and so that background is absolutely fine. What you don't want are obviously pets or children running around in the background, because that becomes distracting. So we had those on the notes that were sent out, and as the pilot developed, of course, most people were sitting down. But we wanted to then play around with, maybe as they would do in a criminal court, actually get them to stand up. Now, of course, that is slightly more difficult, because we have to get them to then maybe alter the position of their laptops, and I'm now moving it over to Dad's shelf. And therefore now I'm standing up, so I might do an advocacy performance standing up, and then we can see a bit of movement. So all these things you can play around with using the online stuff. But I think we have to retain that degree of formality in the briefing notes and then in the actual sessions themselves. Because again, the beauty of gallery view is, if I'm teaching a group of 6, if I see that one of my group is no longer on camera because, okay, they've gone off to get a coffee or they've gone off to do something else, I want them back in that room so that I can see that everybody is there and watching the other performances.
Okay. So then, oh yeah, so another follow-on question from that. So you would be quite strict with ensuring that everybody has their cameras on. It's not that some people might.
Yes, I think I would.
Not very good, or.
Well, you've got to make allowances for that in terms of internet connection. But I would expect to be able to suddenly go to gallery view and see that everybody is there and watching the other performances. Because after all, if we were doing it face to face, they would be made in my group to watch the performances of the others, because you learn from watching those other performances.
Okay. So let's say you are doing it face to face. Like, so if you were coming to Poland or Slovakia to do some advocacy training now, and you were able to do it face to face in a small group, you would have to wear a mask. How do you think it's possible to teach these kinds of skills with your face covered or your lower face covered?
No, not in any way, shape or form. No, I think that there will only be face-to-face advocacy training once the requirement for some form of face covering is removed. Because you need to see, well, firstly, it affects the diction. I can just put my hand across there and my voice totally changes. But it affects the diction. It affects how the entire face looks. And if we are right in our faculty that effective advocacy is all about persuasion, how can you seek to persuade someone when all they're seeing is probably my spectacles and my eyes? You've got to see the rest of the face. In my opinion, others may disagree with me. And so therefore, I would not think there'll be a return to face-to-face advocacy training. You can teach other things with a face mask, fine, but not advocacy. There'll be a return to that once the requirement for face coverings is relaxed.
Okay, okay. Well, that's very insightful and very helpful, I think. So that's the end of our podcast. I just want to say thank you very, very much for all of that really insightful information that you shared with us today, Alistair. And it's great to see you again. It's great to see you looking great.
An absolute pleasure. Thank you for having me, and hope all is well back in Poland.
Thank you, thank you. So we will be in touch with the next discussion on when we're going to have the autumn BLC pub quiz. We will want our charming quizmaster back.
Oh, I'd be delighted to. Obviously, I've been continuing my quizzes with the East India Club back in London, and therefore the database of questions continues to grow. So I've got some wonderful questions waiting for you whenever you give the go
possible
ahead for a further British Law Centre Warsaw quiz.
Thanks, Alistair. Thanks everybody for tuning in. See you all next week at the same time. Have a wonderful day.